Well, welcome to today's event, an online roundtable on September the 17th in 1939 in Belarusian and Polish history, organized by the Forum for Historical Belarus Research. Before I introduce the event more extensively, let me alert you to some important technical details. The discussion will take place in Belarusian and in English, with simultaneous interpretation. You can select your language that you want to listen to and that you would also speak to by clicking on the icon with the little globe on the bottom of your screen. If you need additional information and instructions, please check the chat. There will be some additional instructions and details on how to access the interpretation as well. You should also know that this event will be recorded and it will be published on our YouTube channel of the Forum for Historical Belarus Research. Now there is instructions on how to access the translation in the chat as well. My name is Anika Walke. I'm currently a professor of Holocaust Studies at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the United States. My work focuses on the history and memory of World War II and the Holocaust in Belarus, which is work that many years ago brought me first to Belarus and then as a result also to the Forum for Historical Research on the History of Belarus, the group that is hosting today's online discussion. The Forum for Historical Research on Belarus is a network of scholars kind of under the roof of the German Association for East European Studies, also known as the DGO or DGO in German. The association is funded by the German Academic Exchange Service, also known as the DAAD or DAAD. And the forum could not function without this support. But first of all, it could not function without the wonderful and excellent work provided by Alessia Belanovich-Petz and many, many others. In particular, we benefit from Dr. Gabriele Freitag's presence. As the managing director of the DGO, she has been very instrumental for the forum's work over a number of years. The Forum for Historical Research on Belarus is a platform for scholarly exchange on Belarusian history in its transnational context. Participants of the forum include a number of historians from Belarus who had to leave the country due to political repression and who now live in exile in Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and other countries. The forum actively strives to maintain connections with historians and other scholars who continue to reside in Belarus and work under incredibly difficult conditions. The forum also includes a number of scholars who focus their work on the history of Belarus and who work in Germany and elsewhere, so who are not by origin Belarusian, but have developed a very strong interest in the country, in the culture of the region, and want to maintain their connections as well. We strive to offer a venue for scholarly exchange in a secure or at least protected environment. There is no full security. We're very much aware of that. We support especially young researchers with short-term scholarships, and forum members have also organized a number of meetings and events, including conferences and public or online discussion like today's, mainly to raise greater awareness for the history of Belarus and for current events in Belarus and for their significance for the European Union and beyond. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is very little promise for further funding for the forum, and this discussion may well be one of the last events organized by the forum, and we're very upset about it. The failure of several organizations, including the DAAD, that the forum has approached for further support is disappointing, and it is problematic given the very current moment. I'm thinking here in particular about the recent military training exercises conducted by Belarus and Russia in Belarus, exercises that are increasingly perceived as posing actually very concrete threats to the security of EU member states. I'm also thinking about the release of 52 political prisoners from Belarusian prisons less than a week ago, which came as a result largely of negotiations between the Lukashenko government and the populist US government. The circumstances and conditions of the release, which amounted to forced emigration for the released, shines new light on the horrific conditions within Belarus prisons, but also about the continued repressions within the country more broadly. It also points to the failure of the European Union to support democratic forces within Belarus or among those who had to leave the country and who now live in increasingly precarious legal conditions. I sincerely hope, and I think many members of the forum hope that we will be able to identify and mobilize further resources to secure the work of the forum so that we can continue to host discussions like today's. Let me now turn to today's event, an online discussion on the significance on September 17th, 1939. This day signals in particular the historical significance of Belarus for European and for world history. On this day in 1939, large territories of present-day Belarus were forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union. September 17, 1939, therefore not only marks the renewed division and destruction of the state of Poland, it also signaled the existence of an agreement between the Soviet and the Nazi governments. Since 1989, we know that a secret protocol to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, set out the plan for this annexation. In hindsight, the German invasion of Poland just 2 weeks prior to this annexation marked the beginning of World War II. At the time, people and communities in the affected areas began to experience not only troops and military operations, but also Sovietization at an accelerated pace. Many were arrested for allegedly anti-Soviet attitudes or activities. Others were deported to special settlements or prison camps in the Soviet interior. In 2021, the Lukashenko government declared September 17 the Day of National Unity, celebrating what at the time many perceived as a violent overtaking of land and people. Today's discussion should offer an opportunity to learn more of the effects of the annexation in 1939, but also about current discourses around the event and its recent condemnation. I will now hand over the figurative microphone to Iryna Makhouskaya, who will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. Iryna Makhouskaya has a doctorate in history and specializes in oral history and the social and cultural history of Belarus. In particular, she focuses on everyday life and cultural practices between the 1930s and the 1950s, and among many other publications, has authored a book called Mir, the History of a Small Town as Told by Its Inhabitants, together with Iryna Romanova, also a member of the forum. Iryna is currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where she is developing historical anthropology of social mobilization in Belarus since 1991, and I cannot wait to read the book that comes out of that. Iryna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anika. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends, and everyone who has joined us. Let me welcome you at our discussion dedicated to the event that took place on this very day, on the September 17th, 1939. Shortly, Anika talked a bit about what happened. Well, it is a known fact for interested people, but let's think and discuss how these events affected the civil populations, how the interpretation of these events affects today the civil population, and how it affects the relations between Belarus and Poland. And we will discuss that with our guests. We have a very international team today, and which makes me happy. And we will try to look at the various aspects of this event. So allow me to introduce our guests. First of all, it's Viktor Shadurski, who is an independent researcher who is temporarily residing in Poland. He is constantly collaborating with University of Wrocław and the University of Warwick. Currently, he is a fellow of the European Union program, EU for Belarus, SOL2. In March 2021, Viktor Shadurski was dismissed from the position of Dean and Professor of the Department of International Relations of the Belarusian State University because of his scientific and civic position. At the invitation of universities from Germany, Poland, and the UK, he continued to be engaged in active research, academic, and teaching activities. Currently, his main research topics are the study of the nature of the authoritarianism, its driving forces and prospects of change in the case of Belarus. He is also researching on the theory and history of international relations, foreign and domestic policy of Belarus, and cultural foreign policy of European countries. He has authored over 200 academic publications, including the latest monograph, The Birth of the Belarusian Leviathan, Belarus from the parliamentary republic to an authoritarian regime. Just recently, a few days ago, on the decoder.org, there was an article published by him, actually exactly on the topic of the September 17th. So this article was published in German and Russian language. My greetings to you, dear Victor. And our next participant is Alice Smalianchuk, professor, doctor of historical sciences from the Institute for Slavic Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has authored a great number of academic works, scientific articles, including the monograph Between Regionalism and the National Idea, the Polish Movement on the Belarusian Lands, the Roman Skirmut biography, and also he published a number of books also related to the topic of September the 17th, a series under the first Soviets, which was published, a collection of documents. He also has conducted, he also is the editor of the Home Historian, Belarusian Zeszyty Historyczny, and he has worked extensively on the topic of the September 17th and conducted archival and oral history research. Our next participant is Lidia Zessin-Jurek. She is a visiting professor at Stockton University, New Jersey, US. She researches on her main research topics is Holocaust and genocide studies, with a focus on displacement. She specializes in Eastern and Central Europe and memory of the Holocaust, the Gulag, and the refugee movements. Together with Katarina Friedla, she co-edited the book The Siberian Odyssey of Polish Jews, The Fate of Refugees from the Holocaust, published by the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Currently, she is working on a monograph exploring refugee experience during collapse and absence of state structures, focusing on civilians attempting to flee both the Nazi and Soviet forces in September 1939. My greetings, my greetings to you. I welcome you, dear Lidia. Our next panelist is Dr. Sylwia Szarejko. She's specializing in literature studies, a Polish and Italian philologist. She's a curator at the in the research department of the Severin Novakovsky Research Institute at the Sibir Memorial Museum. She serves on the editorial boards of journals, Bulletin Historia Pogranicze, and also Zeslanets. And she works also for the portal Świat Sibiru. She is also the editor-in-chief of the portal Relacje z Sibiru. Her research interests include the World War II, particularly the Soviet and German repressions, the phenomenon of the so-called Anders Army, the Polish political immigration and migration more broadly, also camp and reportage literature, as well as Polish-Lithuanian relations in 19th and 20th centuries. My heart welcome to you. And before we start the discussion, I would like to invite our participants to ask questions. You can write down your questions in the Q&A section. At the end of the discussion, our panelists will try to answer your questions, all of them or some of them, depending on the time that is left. And the first aspect I would like to pay your attention is the problem of the civilian population in the wake of the events of September 17th. How did this affect the fate of the inhabitants of the civilian populations of Western Belarus? And I would like to start our discussion from Alice Smalianchuk. Thank you very much. This is a very good question. When we think about the events of the 17th of September and what followed, we always mostly focus on national aspects, the unification of the Belarusian lands. One has to remember that in 1921, following Riga Peace Treaty, there was a division of Belarus, and part of Belarus belonged to the Polish state. And for the Belarusian national movement, it was a tragedy. And all interwar period, the Belarusian politicians dreamed of the unification, of the unity. This is the national aspect. But answering your question, how the society changed, how these events affected the fate of the society in the Western Belarus, we start to think, we should think about the cost of this unification. And the things I will share is based on my field studies and all oral history studies on the territory of the Western Belarus, but also on the former border, on both sides of the former border, Riga border. From the very beginning, I would like to stress. So my points, my short intervention, I would call it. So I would call it liberated and enslaved. So when we ask people who lived through that, and you know, the first thing that comes to their mind, it was that the war started. No unification, the war started. We should understand that the 7th of September, the arrival of the Red Army, it was the beginning of the Second World War for the population of the Western Belarus. So it was with the arrival of the Red Army. Well, the Soviet literature was full of the stories of joy of the Belarusian population. Well, the memories, the oral history shows that there was a joy, but not so. So the interwar Poland was an authoritarian state which had a policy of national pressure and limitations vis-a-vis national minorities. Belarusians didn't feel that it was their state. But we know that 600,000 Belarusians were part of the Polish army, and they were fighting alongside the Poles against the Germans. So first there was joy. They greeted people, welcomed the Red Army with flowers, but this joy was short-lived. So they said that they were expecting for Russians, but they were different Russians. So they looked at the external aspects of these armies that was different from the Polish army. They looked at their horses and say that this army used dogs, not horses. So, and the most important, what people recall are truly repression, and the power, the authority of the first so-called Soviets was based on repressions. So assessing the memories of people and the documents on which I worked. So under the Soviets and the next Soviets, the power, the regime was based on two pillars: first, repressions; second, propaganda. Some people believed propaganda. Sometimes we followed some anecdotal stories when soldiers, Red Army soldiers, promised that the Soviet Union has everything and you would have, but people answered, do you have oranges? Do you have oranges in the Soviet Union? We have oranges in the Soviet Union, and our plants produce them working all 4 shifts. And so, but people couldn't react normally to the situation because of repressions. So they saw the repressions, and they saw that this new regime did not protect the lives of the people. And we know that there were 4 waves of deportations from 39 to 41. About 120,000 persons of the Polish Polish population, but also of Belarusians that were deported. But it's not only deportation, but these deportations were documented. But many repressions were implemented without any documenting. So the first days after 17th of September, there were no, let's say, no political power. But on the 7th of October, it is not the first days. So there were people who were killed, and there were no documentary proofs of that. So there were many cases of such killings. People were really impressed that the land was split and confiscated. Very often the Belarusian peasants didn't want to take lands. They refused. They knew, they heard maybe about the collectivization when the Bolsheviks first gave land, so, but then took them over and control everything. So looking at the different documents, well, not only at oral history. So oral history is one aspect, because people were remembering and passing these stories from parents to children. This is a very emotional and personal things. But when we look at the documents of the National Archives of the Republic of Belarus, all the documents we have are governmental, official documents of the Soviet authorities. Reading them, I see that our respondents, our people with whom we talked, were confirmed. So repressions are being hidden behind the sentences about fighting against enemies of the Soviet people. And for an important part of the Belarusian society, there were what happened during the so-called elections to the Popular Assembly was very illustrative as well. Well, Poland had its own problems with elections before 1933, but people didn't know for whom they would vote and so on, and they realized that nothing was dependent upon them. They understood that they had to go into cast their votes, otherwise they would face many problems. And the documents prove also the beginning of the resistance. The actually the disillusionment of the Belarusians and the beginning of the resistance. And the official Belarusian historians do not mention that. So I could find the list of the so-called anti-Soviet organizations that were discovered by the NKVD, and there were surely Belarusians, and they tried to resist and to change the authorities. And in 1940, 1941, people expected the change of the regime. They maybe expected even the arrival of the return of the Polish administration. And then the German occupation came. Another aspect which is very important, when the official sources talk about the unification, it was not a unification. Until 1941, there were no unification, because until 1941, the old border was preserved. To go from Minsk to Grodno, you would need an official authorization. So it was the German advance that united Belarus. And well, this border disappeared when in June 1941 the German offensive started, and there were no border, no Red Army. Wrapping up, well, from the national point of view, this is a very important event, but when we talk about it, we should talk about the cost. So what Belarusians lost in under the authoritarian Polish state, they from the authoritarian Polish state they moved to the Stalinist Gulag. And when we talk about the national aspect, I should remember we should remember the fate of the Belarusian movement in the Vilna region, because this was the real center of the Belarusian nation, one of the centers that was not destroyed. And with the arrival of the Red Army, all these members of this movement were really persecuted and ended up in Soviet camps.
Thank you very much for your interesting thoughts and important highlights. Now, please, Viktor Shadurski. Thank you, Alice. Thank you for this detailed analysis in just 10 minutes. But I'll continue with the discussion. Of course, to understand the meaning of the 17th of September 1939 and other events in Belarus, you should keep in mind the approaches of three major subjects. First one is historic science. This is an attempt to approach difficult questions in an objective way and using scientific arguments with no emotions and anti. That's what we are trying to do today. We are trying to look for sources. So this is one subject. Second one is collective memory, collective or historic or social memory. This is what think their witnesses of those events, how they assess this event, witnesses and their children who could hear something from their parents and grandparents. So this point is controversial because people are different. They represent different social layers. They have different identities. So they can interpret the historic events in a different way. And the third point is a historic policy of a country. And we normally link this historical policy with authoritarian regimes, or the regimes who want to use history in their today's for their today's profit, to find something in history to support their current internal and external policy. So, but still, historic memory is something that democratic countries also possess, but it's a question for discussion, and this discussion is not for today. But still, there are three subjects, and historical memory and collective memory is a very good source because it describes the situation. So I during my studies at the university and just after, I had an opportunity to talk to witnesses of those events. My parents are from Western Belarus. They were Orthodox peasants, but they lived under this Poland rule. And my father, he left his memory. He shared his memories, and in 1997 he wrote a couple of paragraphs about this event. I refreshed it in my memory today before the discussion, so please allow me to read it out, because it's really something that a source that I trust absolutely and totally. So my father lived at the border where Dwina, the Dwina River, was indicating this border. Well, he was born in Western Belarus, and in some time he moved to the other bank of the river. So this is what he shared. Please let me read it out. So, and my father highlights this topic about unity. So what was the unity? What were the contradictions? He was a Belarusian, and that's what he was. Native from Western Belarus were called Psheki here. Apparently, under the influence of the pre-war propaganda, Eastern Belarusians considered their Western compatriots to be enemies of the Soviet people, bad and greedy people, supporters of capitalism. Much later, resentment of younger age of his occasion passed. Thanks God, our grandfathers did not know hunger and cold, pre-war black vans who took away innocent people at night. The only reason for arrest was often that people and their families worked hard and had good harvests. People were afraid to say a bad word about the Soviet government and collectivization. Today, it's even funny to recall that collective farmers who worked on the eastern bank of the Dwina were forbidden to look towards the opposite bank. Collective farmers turned their backs to the Dwina during the smoke break. On our side, the peasants greeted their fellow compatriots but there was no response. However, we would not want to defend life in Western Belarus before 1939. The Belarusian language was in decline. People were converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. But our fathers remained faithful to their faith, language, culture, and customs. There is nothing to reproach them in their endeavors. So I read it out as the memory of my father and a thought of a person who was directly involved in the situation. When we speak about the 17th of September 1999, this was an extremely important event in the history of Belarus, and it had short-term and long-term impacts. One of these impacts was the widening or spread of the Belarusian territory as an independent country in 1991. And yes, today I think everyone agrees that today our international borders are recognized in the world, recognized by our neighboring countries, and I hope this is going to be forever. So thank you, Alice, thank you, Iryna, and let's continue our discussion.
Many thanks, dear Victor. Please, the issue of the civilian population. Dear Lidia, would you like to share your ideas?
Thank you, Iryna. It was really interesting to hear also memory mentioned in the discussion already. In fact, the points that I would like to raise in the context of remembering September 17, 1939, are coming more from the Polish perspective. Also a broader East European view, let's say, and I will also touch a little bit within the wider framework of European memory and also civilians' memory. My first point will revolve around the memory of Stalinism and its relationship to Nazism, two central negative legacies of the 20th century, and how Eastern Europe, particularly the states that joined the EU in the mid-2000s, had sought to integrate the violent legacy of Soviet rule, such as September 17th, into the broader European canon of remembrance, but achieved rather limited success. And my second point touches upon the memory of the civilian dimension of the Soviet invasion, especially the forced population movements that followed. This aspect has recently resurfaced at the Belarusian-Polish border since 2021, seeing migrants subject to border violence. And then, of course, since 2022, on the Ukrainian-Polish border, seeing mass refugee movement from yet another Russian aggression. So starting from the first point, September 17th is of course closely tied to August 23rd, 1939, which has been mentioned already in our discussion when Ribbentrop and Molotov met to divide Eastern Europe into Nazi and Soviet sphere of influence. And their secret pact marked de facto alliance, one that remains uncomfortable to this day when it comes to memory. First of all, it challenges today's Russian narrative, of course, which downplays Soviet co-responsibility for the outbreak of war. And it also challenges Western perspectives that emphasize the USSR's decisive role in defeating Hitlerite fascism, which is true. This was a victory for which Soviet citizens paid a staggering price in blood. So still today, though negatively impacted by the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this view on Russia and its merits in containing fascism prevails, especially among the Western European left. In contrast, Eastern European countries, which were emerging from communism after 1989, they sought to integrate the Stalinist legacy into Europe's collective memory that they were also now part of or they were trying to shape. And their efforts were often met with ambivalence on the side of their Western partners. This was the time when the memory of the Holocaust was being more fully and belatedly consolidated as the moral and historical core of Europe's violent 20th century. And the prevailing expectation was for Eastern Europeans to join a shared reckoning with the crimes against Jewish neighbors and Jewish communities, rather than highlight their own suffering, which many feared might fuel nationalist narratives and sentiments, something that European integration project aimed to leave behind or be a response to or a remedy. So Eastern Europeans seeing in the 2000s that their victimhood was sidelined or they simply grew increasingly frustrated over the years. Unlike Germany, for example, which set the tone of the European Vergangenheitsbewältigung, so coming to terms with the past, they were lacking enough self-confidence to focus mostly on their wrongdoings. And also felt that the fact that the region had endured not one but two major traumas, both Nazi and Soviet, that brought about numerous and in fact yet not properly mourned or recognized victims like these of Palmyre, Lidice, Katyn or Kuropaty, this was not sufficiently acknowledged. So European institutions, in fact, in Brussels became a key battleground for the debate about those asymmetries. East Europeans, as I said, had a growing sense that West Europeans, who were untouched by the Soviet experience of communism, tended to trivialize Eastern historical perspectives. In response, they looked for kind of symbolic counterbalance to Auschwitz-centered Holocaust memory, and they found it in the Gulag, a powerful emblem, right, of their own historical suffering of the region. So their push, in fact, did result in one symbolic achievement. In 2008, the EU designated August 23rd the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which preceded both September 1st and 17th invasions on Poland, as a day of remembrance for the victims of totalitarianism. But today, so more than 15 years later, it's clear that this gesture had done little to truly bridge the memory divide between East and West of Europe. No doubt the instrumentalization of history in domestic, for example, Polish politics has certainly shaped its current memory politics to the main degree. But I would say that the Western reluctance to recognize the importance of dates like September 17th has contributed to this kind of defensive, often uncritical stance Eastern European states represent today in memory. This results in a kind of narrowed historical empathy on both sides. So Eastern narratives underplay or deny local complicity in anti-Jewish violence or against other minorities, while Western narratives often overlook the suffering of non-Jewish Eastern European victims under both Nazi and Soviet rule. I would say that had Soviet aggression in September been more fully integrated into Europe's shared memory, Eastern Europeans might feel more understood today. Instead, the recognition of their trauma was often sacrificed in the West's very well-intentioned effort to build relations with post-Soviet Russia. So inclusion of Russia was prioritized over acknowledging Eastern European fears and traumas. And this, I think, left a lasting gap in West-East European understanding. And so I would say that September 17th stands as one of the clearest examples of a failed memory rapprochement between East and West of Europe. It's an anniversary that remains virtually, I would say, unknown beyond Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, or Ukraine. As such, it is a reminder for Poles, for example, not only of the Soviet invasion experienced at the time as a stab in the back by Poles, this was really deeply confusing and disorienting for the local Polish population. But this anniversary has become also year after year in Poland a reminder of being alone in remembering it. And by this I mean this was not by no means first aggression of Poland's border by its eastern neighbor, as Anika mentioned earlier. And as recent events show, the drone incursions on September 10th this year, 2025, it was not the last. Which brings me to my second point, which is related to the current tense situation on the borderland. From the Polish perspective, we are speaking on the border shared with Belarus and Ukraine. This is a frontier in which I would say in very broad strokes, traces similar contours to those established after September 1939. The memory of 17th of September is being evoked in this context not by one but two historical events that returned totally unexpectedly, I should add, to this geography of the borderland. First, in strictly chronological terms, the forests and rivers that form today's Belarusian-Polish border, the surrounding meadows and fields, have once again become today the site of the blockade of refugees and migrants, of pushbacks, and even a certain type of a no man's land in early stages of the border crisis. Since mid-2021, migrants predominantly from the global south, deliberately funneled into the zone, have found themselves pushed back by border guards on both sides. They are often in a legal limbo. These are, in fact, people deemed a weapon in the so-called hybrid war, right? Dozens of them went missing or had died from hypothermia or drowning, and they are buried in the borderland. Their situation echoes the situation in the autumn of 1939, when the same geographic corridor became sometimes a deadly bottleneck for civilians fleeing Nazi and Soviet plans towards them. Then, too, refugees, particularly Jewish, attempted to cross the demarcation line that divided, let's say, Eastern Soviet and German zones of occupation. But these were not only Jewish Poles escaping Germans, but also other Poles escaping Siberian deportations, which were mentioned in the autumn of 1939 already, and going into the opposite direction, right, to the German zone. Today, so today's events are of a different scale, no doubt, and occur under very different political circumstances. But the repetition of the dynamics of military blockades, pushbacks, and kind of death at the border in this very region is deeply uncanny. Generally, what was in 1939 an effective and direct Soviet attack on the Polish border is now a more disguised attempt at destabilization of the Polish border, which is, fortunately for Poland, for this time protected within the NATO guarantees. And my very last point, and I will be very brief about it, the second phenomenon that is evoking September 17 is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For many Poles, this presents this present, let's say, aggression has reopened intergenerational historical wounds and fears. But beyond the psychological, let's say, impact on the population, it has also reignited the physical geography of displacement. The refugee routes that opened in 2022 strongly mirror those of 1939, not only on the Belarusian northern part of Poland's border, but also on its southern Ukrainian section. Cities like Przemyśl, close to the border, or Lviv back then, part of interwar Poland, have once again become hubs, in fact, of mass movement and humanitarian urgency. So by observing these two developments at the eastern Polish border with Belarus and Ukraine, we are reminded that the legacy of September 17, 1939 is in fact not a closed chapter. The Polish eastern border continues to be shaped by the political and humanitarian consequences of war or wars, displacement, and contested sovereignty. So, in fact, history returns a series of unresolved patterns here, which is very disturbing.
Many thanks, dear Lydia. You have touched upon a very wide spectrum of issues, not only the fate of civilian population in 1939, but also how it is interpreted and presented in current politics, but also in the historic memory. I would like to ask a question to Lydia, but also to Sylwia. How the Polish historical science interprets these events. So these issues that this memory that was not entirely accepted, or of the memory from the Eastern and Central European perspective. Who bears responsibility for this fact that this aspect of the September 17th is not very much recognized? So do politicians hear that, and how it is being used by politicians? Dear Lidia or Sylwia, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. I would like to add, because I come from Białystok, a city that played an important role in the events following the Soviet aggression against Poland in September 1939, when the Red Army occupied the eastern territories of Second Polish Republic. Because here in Białystok, from September to November 1939, a process of incorporation, we can say, of these lands into the Soviet Union was set in motion. And between October 28th and 30th, 1939, Białystok became the temporary capital of these territories, hosting the so-called People's Assembly of Western Belarus. It was there that the decision to unite with the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic was formally adopted and process completed on November 2nd, 1939. And we can only imagine that for many families, for Polish families, Belarusian families, this meant an abrupt change of government, the disappearance of familiar institutions, and soon afterwards, repression, arrests, confiscations, and deportations. Of course, Poles, but also Belarusians, because we were deported also together, yes, into the depths of Soviet Russia. And in daily life, this translated into loss of work, fear, the breakdown of local communities, and forced migrations. And Polish historians emphasize that these events should not be understood only as a military act, but rather as a political and social process. Soviet authorities introduced new administrative structures and a nationality policy that deeply transformed schools, culture, and neighborly relations. And from my personal perspective, as someone from Białystok and a staff member of the Sibir Memorial Museum, this history is not abstract, yes? It is the memory of real human fates, deported families, destroyed communities, and the victims of repressions. For many inhabitants of Eastern Poland, September 17th was the beginning of their real war, a war whose consequences were felt for decades, and sometimes we still feel them, yes. And in Poland, when we think about 17th September 1939, the narrative is unambiguous. The Soviet entry is remembered as an act of aggression and as a pact of the secret protocol of the, of course, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, leading to annexation, repression, and deportation. And Polish scholarship and public memory nowadays strongly emphasize the connection between the collusion of the two totalitarian regimes and the tragic consequences for the region's inhabitants. I remember that in one magazine, in one article, our Polish historian Wojciech Materski argued that the 1939 pact was not defensive, but rather an offensive agreement that prepared the division of spoils in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, that coming from Białystok, I know that local memory is more often nuanced. In borderland cities where Polish and Belarusian cultures coexisted for centuries, interpretations are shaped not only by grand politics, but also by the specific histories of families, neighbors, and communities. And we must also remember about this fact, yes, because we lived in these territories together, and now we also live here together. In Białystok, we have also a big Belarusian community, and nowadays also a Ukrainian one. So when we think about the aspect of the 17th September, we must also think how we can interpret together this fact to coexist nowadays.
Many
thanks, dear Sylwia. Alexander, please, the floor is yours. I would like to say a few words about the so-called Polish aspects. In oral history or memories, that people didn't have any griefs against Poles, discontent whatsoever. Well, I asked once a question that you were liberated from the landowner's domination, and a lady couldn't understand my question. So in the 1939, there was also a dark side of history. They were also violence on behalf from the Belarusian peasants against Polish refugees. Well, but there were also many examples of when Belarusians helped Poles. Near Grodno, I don't remember that people, local dwellers, didn't allow to kill the Polish osadniks, the Polish colonies that were sent there. So it was not a brotherhood, but it was a just human compassion and the desire to help each other. So the story with Roman Skirmont, that really, so the peasants killed Skirmont, Roman Skirmont, but later I understood why it happened. NKVD, when they came to these lands, they understood it should not be them. It's always possible to find somebody who would shoot others. So in Parichi village, the commissars of NKVD were there who were supervising. So we should keep that in mind when we talk about the 17th of September 1939. Very much, Alice. Victor, please. Thank you. I would like to continue this thought. So historic events, especially wars or dramatic events, tragedies, we should be very careful, and the authorities should be very careful about that. So there was, as Alice said, there was still bloodshed, aggression, and so on. But so we cannot admit that there should be only just positive or negative vision. So if there are contradictions, we should not touch upon historic events or military victories, because one can find anything there. That's why historians will find many details that have great importance in history. History is not linear. There we have 100% positive events or negative events, black and white. History is great, or history is colorful. For example, as I mentioned, this event has had its own short-term and long-term consequences, and these consequences were negative, but there were also some, maybe in the future, it played for the benefit of Belarus, let's say. But I would like to ask my question to Lidia. So you mentioned that these events are less maybe interesting. Well, as for Lithuania, I know that Lithuanians are pretty much aware of that, because there were also changes. There were territorial changes. Lithuania received the Vilna region, and it's part of their history. So they see these events as contradictory to some extent. While we don't have Lithuanian historians here, but this is an example that we have to be more careful when we look at these contradictory events. So, Sylwia, you mentioned that you are from Białystok. So the borders, the current Belarusian borders, were shaped not during September 1939 events, but later during the negotiations between the Soviet Union and post-war Poland. These are not just details. We have to bear that in mind and to discuss that. This is another aspect of this history of 1939. So, Lydia, would you like to answer or to specify anything?
Sure. Thank you very much, Victor, for the question and also for your earlier intervention. I think that you are very right by noticing that there are between also Eastern European countries that joined the EU and tried to shape the common memory discourse. There are also unresolved problems and conflicts. It's not only the situation between Poland and Lithuania, but also somewhere more to the south. But when they were entering the EU for the first time, they saw that maybe they have more in common than things that they have that take them apart. Because on the larger scale, they had a bigger stake, let's say, and the stake was to become truly European by getting the right also to co-shape the EU memory discourse, and also to place on the not maybe the same level, of course, not the same level as the Holocaust, but to place the memory of communist crimes of the Gulag, which was chosen as the symbol, next to the memory of the Nazi totalitarianism. But of course, it is a very important point. And Victor, you also mentioned that September 17th or September 1939 in general had both short and long-term consequences. And I think this is also a very important point. Also to recall that the displacement, which was triggered in 1939 and which we have mentioned, did not end with the war, right? It extended into the post-war years through forced population exchanges and state-led resettlements after 1945. So various ethnic people were expelled from newly redrawn Polish territory, while Poles were also relocated westward, right, from the Soviet Union, from the, let's call them Belarusian and Ukrainian lands, and they were displaced into the lands taken from Germany. So this culminated in the dissolution of the centuries-old multicultural and multilingual coexistence, not always friendly, but still coexistence in the borderlands that we are talking about. What was once a densely interwoven region encompassing Polish, Belarusian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Jewish, and other minorities like Tatar or Poleskie, right, identities, and probably you could name more than I can, identities and traditions, was systematically disentangled. Lives were uprooted, communities were broken, traditions were lost or displaced. And this erasure, this disentanglement of something that had been there for centuries, no less than the military invasion itself, is a profound and very important legacy of September 17th, 1939 that we should also mention.
And I would like to thank you, Victor, but I didn't say that the borders were shaped in 1939. I just only described the fact that the People's Assembly of Western Belarus took place in Białystok. But of course, absolutely, the border was shaped in 1945. Yeah.
Дякую, великі колеги. Відавочна, що інтерпретація польська...
Thank you, dear colleagues. Of course, the interpretation in Belarus, from the Belarusian side and from the Polish side are different. And it's not only because of different political situation or it's also because Belarus and Poland were sort of in opposing positions during those events. So the Belarusian side and the interpretation of those events, how do we see them historically? How do we see them in the present situation? In 2021, the Belarusian authorities declared the day of September 17th, the Day of National Unity. What do you think? Do you think this could be considered a celebration, a holiday day? What are the chances to root this idea in their population's mentality that this is a holiday? So, please. Thank you, Iryna. I was thinking about this day and introducing this day as a holiday. So when this decision was taken to call this the Unity Day, the root of that, the cause of that is the political crisis in 2020. This attempt of revolution that was repressed. Poland supported Belarusian democratic forces, and it still supports Belarusian democratic forces. So I think those who introduced this holiday, they were trying to turn Poland into the enemy number one of Belarus. So the second Polish Republic, that was, and the policies it had towards Belarus at that times, to recollect them and to make Poland still responsible for that, today's Poland. So again, I repeat that there was no unification on this day. There was no unity. The old measure, the old border stayed in place. The other thing I wanted to point out is that today's propaganda tries to turn these events as Stalin's present to Belarus. And it ignores that the national processes were in place and Belarusians in Western Belarus were for that. I think all political parties in Western Belarus were in favor of this unification, or not exactly the way it happened, but in principle. So another point why this holiday was introduced is the repression against the current Belarusian historical science. After this was introduced, Belarusian historians in Minsk, in Grodno, they faced difficulties with voicing any alternative point of view, because if you do so, you could be forced into exile, or other repressions could be attributed to you. So people will forget this day, I think. I was very much interested in how this day was celebrated. Even back in 2014, I was following how this was celebrated. I went to a village and bought all official newspapers, but there was nothing about this 17th of September. No, not a single state newspaper was mentioning this day on the 75th anniversary. Online, I found only one local regional newspaper that mentioned this anniversary. I visited the webpage of the Lukashenko's administration, and I found his letter to Tajik president congratulating him on the anniversary, and there was nothing about the 17th of September. So now it's artificially reintroduced. Thank you, Alias, and I will continue. I recollect the Soviet times when I was a student of history, and this event was never remarkable or celebrated. Teachers did not want to raise this question because it was still Soviet time, but students could ask some provocative questions. Why Germans, for instance, and the Red Army started their advances on the same day? Why this happened? So teachers were sort of afraid to stir it up, to face some questions about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret agreement. No one was discussing that at that time. No one was mentioning this because, well, at that time, historians, official historians understood that many difficult issues could be raised, and it's better to avoid this topic, not to stir it up. And the second point is that back then there was no external political interest to this topic. The Polish Republic was a satellite country, and from their side there was no wish to escalate the interests to this historic problem. So it wasn't that much important for the Soviet Union foreign policy. And the third point, witnesses were still alive, and they knew how contradictory was this event. Some people were for, some people were against. So there were people who killed other people. There were victims of displacement. There were those who executed the displacements or who participated in this process from the other part. There was not much in film art, for example. There was a Red Leaves film, I think, filmed about Prititzky, a well-known activist from Western Belarus. But I do not remember if students really wanted to watch it or there was an extreme interest to this topic. So how this was done, there was this film that was showing a group of people, but well, I don't think this was very influential at that time. And currently, is it going to influence the situation? Yes, I think the school children will hear about it, they will learn something. So yeah, I think it will have its impact. But people also have access to objective information online and from different sources. So now this process is more complicated than the authors of this propaganda approach think. I thought that maybe there is a danger that if it's exaggerated, if it's too much, go on, study this idea, maybe the interest will naturally fall. Historians and people should not forget about this idea, but they should have access to different sources and the possibility to discuss it with historians from neighboring countries. And if the pressure is too high, young people in Belarus could have negative attitudes. As you remember, there was exaggeration with the Second World War. I remember people didn't want to study this topic. Young historians didn't want to study the topic of the Second World War because there was too much pressure on that. Still, there was no deep reflection on this topic. There could be much more done, but it was just, people were just fed up with this topic. I was not saying that people are going to forget about the event. People will forget about the celebration of this holiday. Look, but there is a problem here because young people consume information from different sources, and do historians have responsibility to provide this information? Do historians and other public people have to provide different points of view? Is there a problem in the situation in Belarus concerning the accessibility of readable information that would compete with the sources, state propaganda sources, like information days, or like yesterday there was a meeting of Lukashenko with pro-government historians, and they were discussing a new direction in making Poland an enemy, or so far. So do you think there are enough sources? Do you have the Belarusian independent historical community does enough to present research, and also to present readable research or mass reader research? Whom do you ask? So you, Alice? Well, there are not so many opportunities, especially for historians who are researchers. But there is an interesting TV show on Belsat that speaks about historic events. And well, you have to look for internal resource to address Belarusians. But maybe I'm naive, but I believe that Belarusian school children do, and teachers in schools and universities, they do treat it in the right way. There was an attempt to introduce a textbook by Trashchanok, and this textbook was sort of Western Russianism style. And I remember when I visited Grodno University Library to borrow it, but they didn't want to give it to me. They told me, we put it so far away and we don't advise anyone to read it. Of course, nowadays textbooks for school children, this is a different story. But I do believe that Belarusian teachers of history, they are honest people. Of course, they are. We should help them. They are not civil servants, and they should understand that teachers of history, or any teacher, is not a civil servant. They are teachers who have to educate young people, and I think they realize it. I think they understand it. Just they are not going to repeat the same lies that are in the textbooks. I am not that optimistic because teachers work in very rigid conditions, and they do use the textbooks that are obligatory. But well, yes, of course, teachers can be more or less enthusiastic about this or that topic. This threshold they have. They probably have the possibility to show their attitude. Parents is also something we should keep in mind, because they can comment on difficult topics. But yeah, the history of family, the history of your ancestors, this is something that parents share with their children. There are no more witnesses of those events, but there are children of the witnesses. They can share it with their children in their turn. There is this TV show in Belsat, so yeah, and we also address our foreign colleagues with their plea to support Belarusian history, because it's we are doing the same thing, and it's not only the responsibility of Belarusian historians who had to flee the country, and there are many university teachers, school teachers, and independent Belarusian historical science should be supported. That's true. Thank you. We still have some 10 minutes, and we have a couple of questions. But Lydia and Sylwia, can you tell us about the situation in Polish public history? Do you remember about this date? Polish textbooks, do they mention this date, 17th of September? Mass media, do they mention it? How well people are informed about it, and in the mass context? But just a few words, because we're short of time.
If I can start. Sorry, Lydia, I will be first. So I think that generally official memory policy functions as a filter. It determines which events are highlighted, which are forgotten, and which are reinterpreted. In Poland, September 1939 is firmly embedded in a narrative of double aggression by Germany and the Soviet Union, and of the associated losses and repressions. Institutions of memory, museums, commemorations, and education maintain and transmit this perspective. But for example, yes, in Western Europe, by contrast, knowledge of the details of September campaign is often limited. Yes, and this difference in awareness produces gaps in empathy and understanding. But I think that from 1999, we talk freely about the events of September 17th. Now we have more and more museums which talk about these events. Also my museum, the Siberia Memorial Museum, but also others. And yes, this topic is alive. Yes, we listen to Siburak's testimonies as well as and other victims of Soviet repression. So it is a very hot subject and discussed subject nowadays.
Дякую велике, сподарня Лідія.
I have nothing to add. I would definitely agree that September 17th would be never forgotten. It is all in the Polish media, right? It's every year by year, present as a topic, and it is 1st of September and then 17th of September, obligatory, mandatory mention in public media.
Дякую велике, дорогі колеги. Есть у нас
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We have some questions from the chat. Why Belarusians did not participate in the Baltic chain, for example, in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? This was a huge success. Why didn't it happen in Belarus? So probably this is a question to Belarusian researchers. Maybe Victor. It's not exactly my topic, but what I can say is that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were independent, and Belarus was still not independent. It was Belarusian Soviet Republic, part of the Soviet Union. Yes, I can agree that the Baltic states were ahead of Belarus. They were setting an example to Belarusians. And Belarus was one of the most countries that are in favor of socialist style. Well, it was not really possible, and I do not know all the details. If Belarusians could, they would join, I think. Yeah, Belarusians knew about the chain, but at the national level, it was difficult to carry out because the authorities were against, the police was against. There was no support from the authorities. So yeah, we should just take it into account. Yes, the situation back then in Belarus was different from the Baltic states. The Baltic states were ahead, and even the Belarusian Popular Front leaders were set in the Baltic states as an example. And not even the conditions only, but also historic consciousness, the knowledge of history. Belarusians simply didn't have enough of it at that time. Thank you. We only have 4 minutes and we won't manage to reply all the questions. Dear colleagues, please, can you just sum up our discussion in just a couple of sentences and share your impressions? Or add anything that you would like to add. So let's start with Victor. So thank you to all the colleagues, our Polish colleagues, and I just want to address those at the other bank, so to say. Let's discuss history, keeping in mind all the details. It's not possible to focus on some arguments and not to focus on other arguments. We have to be sincere. I understand that it's difficult, but this is what we should do. We should discuss this topic from the historic point of view, not from the political point of view. With no emotions, only this way Belarus will still maintain its geographical borders as it does now. Let's use arguments. Alice? Just some oral history examples. I ask people which Soviets were better, first Soviets or second Soviets. Second Soviets are after the Second World War. They say first Soviets were better because they disappeared very fast. And I mention this because Belarus now lives through the epoch of the third Soviets. Maybe they will disappear even faster than the first ones. Thank you. Sylwia, please.
I would like to thank you very much. And also I would like to say that, of course, history is beautiful. It's amazing, but at the same time, very dramatic. And we should remember that divergence complicates dialogue, but also demonstrates why we need polyphonic memory work. And it is very important, and I hope we will still work on it together, not only online. Thank you very much.
Дякую.
I also wanted to thank you for this invitation, because from my point of view, I study mostly the East-West, let's say, European memory. I see that we do not have enough dialogue between on other axes, let's say. And someone in the chat was asking about Ukrainian, Belarusian, for example, connections and interactions. And I think these are very legitimate questions, because we tend to look towards the West most often, and we should probably work much more on our here internal Eastern European history, connections, shared experience, common Sovietization policies, deportations, exile, shared borderland, also networks, underground political contacts, which may have been limited, but they existed. So I think that there is still a lot of work in front of historians and also memory scholars, and I'm very happy that this type of moments bring us together and they inspire us to do so.
Дякую, великий. Літерально на опошніх
Thank
секундах я
you
хочу
very
подякувати
much.
всім
And now it's my turn to thank all the participants and our audience. We really had huge audience. Thank you for all interesting questions, and sorry that we couldn't reply to all of them. Thank you very much, and see you later. Bye bye.